That's most kind. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. Lovely to see you. Now I'm delighted to be assisted today by Juliana, and so thank you very much to Juliana for playing, and if we could give her a round of applause as well. Thank you. And we're here to talk today about the Fantaisie in F minor, Opus 49 by Chopin. Nice picture. Now, why the Chopin F minor Fantaisie? Now, quite a few years ago, we had a series of lunchtime recitals at school where we took it in turns as members of staff to either do masterclasses or talk about pieces. And the F minor Fantaisie came up. And I was quite pleased to do that all that time ago because actually, and this feels like an awful confession, it's a piece that I didn't particularly enjoy. And I'll talk about the reasons for that as the talk goes through. I've changed my mind, partly as a result of having talked about it all those years ago. Can I just start from asking how many of you know the F minor Fantaisie of Chopin? Could you just put your hand up if you do? Because this is actually quite interesting. It's fine, okay. Because one of the things that we have to deal with when we're talking about this piece is what it's like for the first audience who heard it. Because there are certain elements to the piece which should have been very significant to Chopin's first audience, and that's before the piece has ever been played in public. So it's quite interesting to see if we can recreate, to some extent, what it was like to be in Chopin's audience. So I'm going to try and do that later. So just have a little bit of the background. This talk's called Fact from Fantaisie. Now, some of my facts are just opinions, but there are some facts to start off with, and there's the first one. These are incontrovertibly true facts. Chopin was born in 1810, and he unfortunately did die only 39 years later. Now then, before Chopin was born in 1791, there had been in existence a commonwealth between Poland and Lithuania, which had been in existence for 200 years, a period of great stability in an area of the world where there has been a lot of instability. But in 1791, that was dissolved. So that's the world into which Chopin was born 20 years later, well, 19 years. But it's quite significant. Now, why Lithuania? Lithuania is what this turns out to be all about. Next thing, this old commonwealth between Poland and Lithuania gets partitioned a lot in this time. Basically, surrounding this area, you've got three big powers, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And they keep sort of invading and dividing the area up. Poland has suffered, I'm very fond of saying this, it's suffered for being flat. It's very hard to defend yourself if you are a flat country. Much easier if, like Switzerland, you're surrounded by mountains. You can be neutral if you're surrounded by mountains. Very hard to be neutral if you are flat. Cavalry goes very well over flat land, and subsequently tanks do very well as well. And that is why Poland has such an unfortunate history. So there's an independent Congress of Poland formed in 1795. And in 1830, aged about 20, Chopin leaves Poland. In the same year, and a month later, there's an uprising in Poland against Russia. And basically, as a result, the little bit of autonomy they had as the Congress of Poland was taken away, and it was even more assumed into Russia. So the year after that, Chopin settled in Paris, one of the many Polish expatriates in the Great Immigration. He never went back to Poland. The rest of his life was basically in France. Now then, the year after he settles in Paris, a piece of music. Has anybody heard of Litwinka by Karol Kopinski? I'm not surprised. Up until I did the research for this talk, I had never heard of the piece Litwinka by Karol Kopinski. And to my shame, I'd never heard of Karol Kopinski. But apparently he was a very significant Polish composer. And Litwinka is something that we will be returning to. Does anybody know what Litwinka means? Do we have any Polish speakers here? Or any Yes! It means Lithuania, yes. So this is a piece by a Polish composer that is Lithuania. 9 years after the publication of that piece, Chopin writes the F minor Fantaisie. Okay. So that's the sort of context, the historical context for the piece. Now, why the F minor Fantaisie? Why is it a piece that's worth talking about especially? To a lot of commentators on Chopin's music, it's a particularly important piece because it is a piece in which he is structurally innovative. A lot of Chopin's music is essentially in a sort of ternary form. There's an opening section, an A section, there's a contrasting middle section, and then it goes back to the first section. A lot of his music can be described as that, a sort of journey away and a return back. The F minor Fantaisie does not do that, and it's structurally more complicated. And it turns out that it is structurally very rigorously thought through. One of the things that initially I found irritating about the piece was this title, Fantaisie, because I had this rather immature attitude that if a composer calls a piece a fantasy, it generally means they don't know what they're doing. Now, this is not true. But I would hold up as an example of where I still think it's true. The last movement of Sibelius 1 is a fantasy and it's a mess. I will argue that with anybody. That's fine if you want to. Okay. See me later. But this is not the case of the fantasy. And in fact, Chopin is doing something very specific. And the reason for calling it a fantasy, I hope, will become apparent as we go on. Okay. Some initial thoughts that people had about the fantasy. This is what they said about it. This is what Chopin said on the day that he finished it. So, today I finished the fantasy and the sky is beautiful. There's a sadness in my heart, but that's all right. If it were otherwise, perhaps my existence would be worth nothing to anyone. It's a very romantic thing to say, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what it means, but that's how he was feeling the day he wrote it. This is what Schumann said in general about Chopin's music. If Nicholas I of Russia could know that in Chopin's works there lurks a dangerous enemy, he would place a ban on his music. Chopin's works are canon buried in flowers. Now, I think that is very apposite for this piece, as it will turn out. And later, in the 20th century, Adorno said this, a listener must stop up his ears not to hear Chopin's F minor Fantaisie as a kind of tragically decorative song of triumph, to the effect that Poland was not lost forever, that someday she would rise again. Now, that is a very perceptive comment, because at the time he said that, which is about 1960 or so, the link between this piece Litwinka, which I'm going to be talking about, and the fantasy wasn't generally known. But when you know that this piece is actually embedded in the Chopin, this nationalistic flavour to the music is very evident, and it's a very important part of what the piece is about. So then, now, this is the piece Litwinka by Kopinski. So it was said to be sung by the whole of Poland and the whole of the Great Emigration. This was a very popular tune, indeed. And this is where we have to use our imaginations because we are not the audience of 1840. We are the audience of 2019. And what was popular in 1840 is not what's popular now. However, can I just borrow the piano, Juliana? If I were today to play this, can you put your hand up as soon as you recognise this? Some of you are very slow. Okay. Now, that was Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. If you don't know it, you have got a very high cultural life, and well done. But I was trying to find something that I thought most of you would recognise very quickly. Did you ever... there used to be a TV game called Name That Tune. And the game was that you had to sort of say how many notes you could recognise a tune in. I do think that Bohemian Rhapsody you can probably recognise after a couple of, you probably name that tune in 3, possibly 2. Anyway, my point here is that this tune, Litvinka, which we will look at in a minute, we have to imagine knowing it as well as we know Bohemian Rhapsody, or as we know A Hard Day's Night of the Beatles, or anything like that. Okay, so this song is very, very popular indeed. And Wagner, now I didn't know, this is not a piece I've yet listened to, but there's an overture by Wagner called Polonia. Has anybody heard it? Right, well, there we are. That's a bit of research for us all, but it's got a couple of phrases from this song. So even Wagner knew about it, and he used it. Now then, Chopin doesn't quote much of the tune directly in the Fantaisie, but he alludes to it. And this is where we have to try and get familiar with the tune in order to understand how he is alluding to it. Now, the first review of the Fantaisie that came out was published in Warsaw. This gentleman, Józef Sikorski, wrote that phrases characteristic of our music can be found already in the march that opens the Fantaisie. So the Fantaisie starts with the march tune, and it is characteristic of Polish music. This method that Chopin is using in the Fantaisie is something that was suggested actually by Kopinski. He encouraged composers of wordless works to use fragments of songs which, as he wrote, have a certain significance, as souvenirs etched into everyone's memory. For example, the tone of that march sets Polish troops before your eyes. So he's suggesting that this is something that composers should do, pieces that are allusive, and to give them meaning and character and significance, yes. Now, we have also records of Chopin doing an awful lot of improvisation. Marilski recalls the young Chopin improvising on Niemczewicz's historical songs in the boarding school run by his father. And over a decade later in Paris, he did the same in the presence of Niemczewicz himself. And this is also mentioned by Liszt in his book about Chopin. So Chopin is a well-chronicled improviser, a big part of what he did as a performer. And finally, the Chronicle of the Polish emigration published an account of one soiree hosted by Prince Karolicki at which Chopin improvised delightful fantasies from Polish melodies. I'm just saying all that to say that what I'm saying about this piece is sort of chronicled and is not just supposition. There we are. So this is the tune. Now then, could you just have a chord of F major, please? Right. So we are the Polish émigrés of Paris, and we would know this song. Da dum da 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 dum da dum da da dum da dum da da dum da da dum 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 da dum dum da dum da dum da 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 dum da dum da da dum. I'm sorry to do this to you, but would you all sing that with me, please? Dee dum. Here we go. 1 and da dum da 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 dum da dum da da. One more time, and I want you to know it. The last time, I won't ask you to do it again. 1, 2. Da dum da 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 dum da dum da da dum da dum da da dum da da. Thank you very much. Okay, now then, if you have lived with that tune for 9 years as a Polish émigré in Paris, and Could you just play the first 3 notes of the Fantaisie, please, Juliana? Just the first 3 notes. That's the first 3 notes of the Fantaisie. Da dum da da. Now, this is a tricky thing, and what I'm asking you to imagine is that when I play this, you know that's Bohemian Rhapsody. If you are in Paris in 1841 and you are a Polish emigre, if somebody plays, you think da dum da 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 because you know that tune. It's what Chopin does after that is completely different. Could you just play the opening phrase, please, Julian? So what we have instead is just a descending sequence taken from the first bar of that piece. Okay. Now then, this is not the whole of Litvinka. I thought it would be too much to ask of you. But could you please play the from the second march? Okay. Dum da dum ba da dum da dum ba dum. Third bar here. Can you hear there's a very similar melodic contour, very similar rhythmic contour. And so in sort of slightly transformed ways, slightly altered ways, Chopin is using material from this tune. I'll leave those with you as 2 examples. There is a third one. Could you just play the very end of Litvinka, please? It's a pretty shocking tune. I won't. Well, I will. I tried to get a translation of this because I found the lyrics in Polish, and I put it into Google Translate, and it makes no sense at all. But this is what Google Translate said the chorus was: "Hop, hop, pony to Lithuania. This forged horseshoe. There is also a battle template, saber as Kietsiuta." I honestly don't know what that means. But as you go through it, there are phrases which do make sense. Let's go greet the Lithuanian valleys. Now, I've got to say, when I got this translation and it kept talking about Lithuania, I didn't understand why Polish people in exile would be so bothered about a song about Lithuania. But when you have the historical context of that period of stability and peace being when Poland and Lithuania are together, it makes more sense, I would suggest. The bit that goes hop, hop, pony to Lithuania, which is the chorus, goes like this. And the last 2 chords, can you just play the last 2 chords? We have this octave leap. Now, something that keeps coming through the Fantaisie is, could you just do the 3-octave thing? There's that octave gesture. And again, I think that's connected there. I feel slightly hesitant to make some of these suggestions because we don't know. But the connection is there, and then the more that you get to know the piece, the Litvinka, and the more you know the Fantaisie, the more you possibly will hear connections. My point today is to give context for the piece. The piece is a nationalistic piece, and it's about something. That's a very important point. Right, so let's get into I'm going to now forget Litvinka, and we'll just get into a little bit of detail about the Fantaisie itself. So the piece starts with an introduction, and we have 2 march tunes. Could you just give the first few bars, please, Juliana? So this is the first march in F minor. Carry a few more bars would be nice. Thank you very much. And that goes on for about 20 bars. And then we have the F major march. Dum, bum, ba-dum. Thank you very much. Okay. So that's basically the material of the introduction. Then we have a cycle of themes. This bit here, I'm going to come back to. It's basically a period of music which is sort of improvisation, written down improvisation. What we have in the Fantaisie is Chopin as composer and Chopin as improviser. And there are bits of the piece which, where the harmonic rhythm is very fast, it's very intense, there's a big sweep to it. That's the sort of composer element. And then there are bits where that tension is relaxed, and it sounds like improvisation. In fact, I think since I'm talking about it, could you just do that, the first one? From about, where am I? Sorry, in your school. Yeah, here we go, yeah. So that's basically just a decorated chord. And carry on a little bit. Okay. And so on. I will come back to that because there's more to it than just improvisation, of course. Then we have a succession of themes which go through a variety of keys. So could we have the first theme, please? No, yeah, that's it. That's the A flat bit, that's what I was trying to show. So can you go on? Thank you very much. And then the C minor bit. Yes. Then the E flat bit. So da 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 da. All the octaves, where's the octaves? Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And then we get to a march tune, and this is the fifth idea. So it's a succession of melodic ideas, and each one has a key. And I'll come on to patterns of keys in a minute. When I was doing the Beethoven talk a few weeks ago, an ex-pupil was here, Andrew Garrido, and we were talking about the fact I was going to talk about this piece. And he said, what are you going to say about it? Because basically, it does the same thing twice. And when he said that, the wind was knocked out of my sails a bit, because to an extent, he is right. Because this is what comes next. We start, these buttons. We start another cycle. So after all of that music, we have another improvisation section. Then we have the first theme again in C minor. The second theme comes again. Now, you'll notice here that the relationship is different. The relationship from F minor to A flat is that the root has gone up a minor third. It's from relative minor to relative major. This is quite extraordinary. Could you just play a chord of C minor? And now a chord of G flat major. The roots are a tritone apart. My cycle of keys will be coming up and we'll be talking. It'll be great fun. But that's very interesting. Now, the reason that happens is that what he's setting up is the heart of the piece. Now, I have borrowed a quotation here to describe this bit. Luft von anderen Planeten. Do you know what that's from, Mr. Fong? Yes. Oh, so nice. That's Schoenberg's second string quartet. It's what the soprano sings. There's a soprano in Schoenberg's second string quartet. And it's the moment where Schoenberg abandons tonality and embraces atonality. And it's air from a different planet. I breathe the air from a different planet. Now, I've borrowed that because what happens here in the Fantaisie is that we hear music that is completely different to everything else. And it is in a most extraordinary key. It's in B major. Could you just give us a little bit of that, please? Sorry to keep stopping. Could you just play a chord of B major? And here's a chord of F minor. See, it stands apart in tonal terms. It stands apart in the texture. It stands apart in the time signature. It stands apart rhythmically. The whole bit, all of that section is unlike anything else in the Fantaisie. And it's very, very important. Then we get all those themes again. And it's pretty well a literal transposition. So instead of starting in F minor, we start in B flat minor. Second theme goes upper minor third. In a tick, I'll have all this on one slide, and you can see, you can do the comparisons. It is actually the same music. So this is when Andrew said to me, it's the same thing twice. He's right. That is exactly the same as the first cycle of themes, but just in a different key. And then we have a coda. Now, this reminiscence here is a reminiscence of the hymn to the B major tune, but it's been brought into the relative major. So it's been brought more home. Could you just play a little bit of that moment, please? And that's all we get of it. And there's just a little bit of improvisation, and we have a coda to finish with. Now, I think that's the moment at which what Adorno said about the piece is borne out to be very true. Because when we have this, what I've called the hymn, that bit that stands apart, the thing that is completely different to everything else, it feels distant and unattainable and out of our reach. And it is, if you like, an idea of freedom or of an independent Poland, however we want to think about that. When we get it back here, it feels more attainable, it feels more real. But it's just a memory of this thing. It's very powerful, and it works through tonality, and it works through our memories. But the idea that this thing is attainable and is going to happen, it is a certainty that this thing will happen. It is there. It's musically there, and brilliantly done. Now then, I hope you can see that that's basically everything I've shown you, but on one slide. And the reason for that is, if you just bear with me, I want to go through what he's doing tonally, because it is very interesting. So the piece is a Fantaisie in F minor. So there's our F minor. And then the first thing that happens is we go to the tonic major. And in the cycle of keys, that is quite a move. That's a move 4 degrees sharp round the circle. Okay? That's the only bit in F major in the whole piece. Then we have these first cycles. So the first theme is F minor. He goes to A flat major, that's the relative major, and the root is going up a third. Then he goes to C minor, the root is going up a third, it's 1 degree sharper on the cycle of keys. He goes to E flat, root up a third, same step round the circle. So although he's moving in thirds, which is not a standard classical thing, he's not actually doing anything too outrageously exciting. It's all closely related keys. Then we have the second cycle, and we start in C minor, which has got a sort of dominant relationship. Then we have that extraordinary lurch down here, and that sets us up for the tune in B. And those of you who know how my mind works will realise that I was thrilled that B is the same distance from F minor as F is. Isn't that good? It's a well thought through thing. These things, every time I do any analysis, I keep thinking of that quote from The Incredibles. Coincidence? I think not. This is no coincidence. This is balance. In that respect, what Chopin's doing is actually very classical. A move in one direction is balanced by a move in the opposite direction. If you go sharp, you do the same amount flat. There we are. So that's the, where am I? We've done the hymn, we're in B major. Then we go B flat minor. So we started flat of F minor. We go upper minor third to D flat. We're back in F minor, back to the relative major. And in fact, from there on, we stay in the relative major. So the piece ends in the relative major of the key that it started in. And in that respect, it's less tonally adventurous than Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But there we are. But I always find it interesting to look at things like that and think of it in terms of balance. This is a very balanced piece. It is a well-structured piece. I would like to do one consideration of what goes on in the improvisation sections. Could you go to after the first section, after the introduction, the first bit of that we should play just now. Okay, now then. Again, coincidence? I think not. This is where I'm looking now. I've done it again. I'm looking now at this improvisation. Okay. First thing you hear in improvisation is this. Could you just play the beginning of the improvisation? It's a chord of F minor. Next thing you hear, chord of A flat. Next thing you hear, chord of C minor. Coincidence? So these improvisation things are not just a bit of tootling around. They're actually saying something about the music. They're telling you about the harmony that's coming. They're setting up the tonal world. And in fact, they are just little map sections of what's going to happen after it. It's fascinating. But what you get in those sections as well, as I was trying to say, is this sort of feeling of relaxation. Because the music that comes after is very, very intense. And they also have a sort of emotional function, which is to let us relax, because the rest of it is very, very stressful music. Okay, I've rather spoilt the caption of this by having it brought it. Here comes the pie chart. Now, one of the aspects to the organisation of this piece, which I find most interesting, is how Chopin organises these sections and how they balance each other. And this is down to duration. There is one thing in the score that tells us about how we should play it. And it's the instruction that after the introduction, which is in 4/4, the first cycle here is double speed. In other words, minim of that section equals crotchet of that section. Now, when you do that, to get these figures, these percentages, what I've done is counted the beats in this piece. It keeps me happy and off the streets. Okay, so I'm going to put a proposition to you, having done this. If 4/4 here gives you about a fifth of the piece, and 2/2 here gives you, admittedly, a little bit more than a fifth of the piece, if we put together this bit, which is what I call the Love from Under and Planet, and the exceptional bit in B major, that, with the sort of aborted second cycle, together makes, again, about 21% of the piece. Same as that. And then the third cycle also is 21% of the piece. Now, I have to make an assumption to get those figures, but my argument, and this is where I think Chopin is fascinating, is that these proportions, I don't know how consciously, are in his mind. either from his experience as a composer, his experience as a performer, or his experience as an improvising performer. He has a sense of balance. He has a sense of proportion. It's a big part of composition, what feels right. Just as a by-the-by, I don't know, have any of you been to see a Philip Glass opera in the Opera House? Philip, I had this wonderful experience of Philip Glass. I really didn't. Again, it's very interesting when you start off with a negative experience or a negative feeling about somebody. Philip Glass is not somebody whose music I really liked, but I went to see Satyagraha at ENO, and it's a... Does that for hours and hours and hours. And then you get to sort of stuff right there's a... No, that's not very good. No, yes, or contrary motion usually. And it goes on and on and on, and this music's so boring and repetitive. But why I would argue he is a good composer is that when you go to see this in the Opera House, he sets something going, and at the moment, just at the right moment, he changes it. His sense of proportion is really, really good. And you have to experience it to understand what I'm talking about. But when you hear, if you commit yourself to listening to 2 hours, 3 hours of this music, he knows what he's doing. It's very, very well done. And I would say the same is true of Chopin. I think he's got that instinct for proportion. Now, I'm saying all that because I don't know, I cannot say for certain that this is what Chopin was thinking. But what I want to argue is in order to get that proportion, I've made a tempo relationship. What I've done to do that is I've said that the crotchet from the marches, da-dum, da-da-dum, is the same as the minim for the middle bit, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, which is what Chopin says. He tells us that. If then you take that same thing as the quaver for the B major bit, da-dee, do-do-do-do-do, then you get the proportion. Now, what that does for the pianist is makes that section unbearably slow. Because what the piano is not very good at, whisper it, is legato. Now, the big part, I know, I'm very aware that Mr. Fong's there, and I would like you to disagree with me. But and in fact, Charles Rosen says this in his book about piano music. What you're doing a lot of the time is you're creating an illusion of legato, because the physics of what you do with the piano is you hit a string and the note dies. That is what is happening every time you play a note. Inescapable fact. But we fool our ears by use of pedal and by phrasing things and incrementally using different intensities of notes to give the impression of legato. It's a big part of the skill of being a pianist, but it is an illusion. And when you play something like this very slowly, that illusion is harder to sustain. But I do think that musically it's the right thing, because it makes the proportions work. So I've asked Juliana to try and do that. I would also like to point you towards YouTube. Somebody has done a fantastic compilation of performances of the Fantaisie, just one after the other. Great pianists, and you have about 8 performances, one after the other. Rubinstein, and so on and so on. And see, you can compare what these people do. And I was just checking that there is at least 1 or 2 performances there that agree with me, and the 2 people who agree with me are Kissin and Ashkenazi. Their performances, this section is pretty well as slow as I've asked Juliana to do it. I really believe that sort of working on those relationships between those sections is the key to the piece. That said, of course, Chopin is a 19th century composer. He was a 19th century performer, and you would expect rubato. You do not expect it to be played metronomically. But within that, I think at core, those relationships are important. So what I would suggest, and I do this very tentatively, is when you're playing this piece, I would work from how fast you want to play the fastest music. So could we just see if we can do this together, Juliana? Where's a good place to go? Are you happy to go from there? Yeah. And just as you would normally play it. So the opening would be that speed. Okay, and that is reasonably close to da dum da da dee da, which is what the audience knew. Okay, it's a little bit slower, but bear with me. Okay, so if we take that speed, and then could you do the B major bit, going B. Very slow, but it works. Thank you. Now, very, very often you don't hear it played like that. I think it's quite hard to play it that slow. A lot of these recordings on this YouTube compilation is much faster than that. So I cannot say that this is right, but I think it is. So we're going to finish today with Juliana playing the entire Fantaisie. I've got to say, she's been very accommodating with all these suggestions. It's been a delight to talk to her about this. And so, no pressure. If you go off, it doesn't. Just do your own thing. But this is the whole of the F minor Fantaisie. I'm going to move these things out of the way. I'm going to put the lid up on the piano. And see if this all makes some sense.